I've always had incidents with paranormal activity, but this one story still baffles me and everyone involved to this day. Just thinking about it now gives me goosebumps. For a bit of background info, this occurred in Lake City, Florida. My husband and I found the perfect house for our family of 5 in 2007. It was a huge 2,000 plus square foot mobile home on 5 acres, 4 bedrooms with 2 baths. It was amazingly within our budget, only $830 a month and rent to own. So we signed the contract assuming the low price was due to it being in the middle of nowhere. Our 3 kids were 9 months, 3 years, and 5 years old at the time. The older 2 were ecstatic to finally have a room of their own, but this was short-lived after moving in. From the very beginning, we were all a bit anxious in the house, but we kept saying it was due to the large size of the home. We moved from a very small 2-bedroom apartment, and it being located so far out in the middle of nowhere in the country, plus it being a new house, period. It started by us noticing lights on that we knew were supposed to be off, doors being open that were supposed to be closed and vice versa. Bumps in the middle of the night with no explanation. The kids all started having night terrors, and after about a week, we discovered the older 2 kids asleep on the 9-month-old's floor beside her crib. They started doing this every night. My 5-year-old daughter had such bad dreams one night it caused her to vomit. She came in crying and throwing up, saying there was a man on fire floating outside her window. She was truly terrified. Back then I worked night shift, and my husband was the one dealing with the freaky incidents at home at night. After several months of various incidents, my husband had to go out of town for 2 weeks due to his job. They were going to build a house in Steinhatchee, Florida. Since I was working night shift, the kids were shipped off to the grandparents. This event happens on the first night of my 2 days off, and my mum said she'd keep the kids for an extra night so I could catch up on some much-needed sleep. Now, backing up. The town my husband was working in did not have cell reception for our carrier, and the only place he could get service to call was in the town standing in a very specific location, so he couldn't call from the job site or the house they were staying in, and I rarely got to speak to him while he was gone. He literally had to drive into town, stand next to one of those large ice cream maker machines, which he discovered by accident one morning while getting their cooler ice for the day, that his phone randomly downloaded all his missed texts, so he figured he got service while standing there specifically. On my first night alone in this house, I was truly scared after several hours of hearing things. Here I am, beyond exhausted from barely getting any sleep the week before, and I can't sleep because of the house noises. I went out to the couch and decided to try and fall asleep with the TV way up loud to drown out the noises. I carried a weapon under my pillow and another one next to me and felt safe enough to fall asleep. At 3 a.m., a call wakes me up. I looked at the screen and it said, "My baby, aka husband." I answered. He was in a panic. "Honey, are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" He's freaking out, telling me he had a nightmare. He asked if I was asleep on the couch. He asked if I had a weapon under my pillow and another one next to me, saying specifically what they were. He asked what I was wearing, and I said yes to all his questions. He even confirmed the direction my head was. This were all things that he should not have known, considering we hadn't spoken a number of days. He's all but hysterical at one point, saying he had a nightmare where a man broke in and did horrific things to me before ending my life. Any other time I would have called him crazy and told him I was staying put, but there was something about his voice and the desperation that got me out of the house. At this point I decided to leave, especially considering how out of character it was for him. And I heard a bang coming from the opposite end of the house. My blood runs cold. It was almost like a bad omen. Since he's not the type to normally act like this, I panic and make him stay on the phone with me while I grabbed the car keys and my purse. I hit the button on the car to turn on the lights and make a run to the car. I got the hell out of there, not bothering to change clothes or grab anything. Once he verified that I was on the road safe, he said he'd call me tomorrow and check on things. I then called my mum to let her know I'm coming, and I tell her the story of how this all came to be. I drove the 45 minutes to her house, shaking the entire way. After arriving, and some time talking to her, I settle in and fall asleep. I tried calling my husband in the morning, but kept getting voicemail. That's completely normal for the town he's working in. At this point, I must go to the house to grab clothes and a few bits. I made my mum go with me because I was still freaked out by everything, and there was no way I was going back there alone. When we get there, I immediately noticed the screen had been cut and the window was broken out. Picture a normal double-wide mobile home with a large deck and a window on either side of the door. The window that was broke out was the one right next to the door. I called the police immediately. They cleared the house and walked through with me to see if anything was missing and to add to the report. There wasn't. I wouldn't have known if someone had been in there if it hadn't been for the screen and window being broken. I tried to call my husband, but couldn't get through to him. And after leaving several voicemails, he finally called. I told him that his weird nightmare just might have saved my life, and explained everything to him. He's completely at a loss and asked me what the hell I was talking about, that he hadn't called me. I froze. Yes you did. He's adamant he didn't. He says he didn't have a nightmare, nor did he call, and we argue for several minutes because I knew he called. How could he? When he said when he was at home all night, and he only got cell service in one place. That hadn't even crossed my mind at that point. I told him to check his call logs. He didn't have any outgoing calls. My phone, however, showed that I had received a call from my baby at 3 a.m. I sent him a screenshot of my phone, and he has no recollection of ever calling or of the nightmare. I'll never forget the panic in his voice, the desperation for me to leave, the details he couldn't have known. Who called me and saved my life that night? The police didn't find any fingerprints or anything that could lead to an arrest. We ended up moving out very soon after, because we didn't feel safe, especially when we were dealing with a haunting at the same time. I spoke to 2 of our neighbors, and they said no one ever leased it for more than 6 months. Where I'm stuck is who called. I live about a 5-minute walk away from a train station, and I work 1 stop away, about a 5-minute walk from that train station. It makes economic and environmental sense for me to get the train to and from work rather than drive, so that's what I do. One morning at about 8:30 a.m., I was walking to work out of the station I arrive into, and a man walking in line with me about a meter away started waving at me. I had my AirPods in, so I didn't actually notice he was trying to get my attention for a while, but eventually I took them out, expecting him to tell me my lace was undone or that I had something in my hair. Instead, he simply said hello and proceeded to try and initiate a conversation. He asked how my morning was going, for my name, and told me my name was Beautiful, and then asked if I had a boyfriend. I don't have a boyfriend, but in this instance I told him I did to try and close the conversation, which didn't work. He proceeded to walk with me all the way to my place of work and carried on walking straight up. This is not uncommon, as I work in a popular business district with lots of offices, so I assumed he just worked further up than me. It was the sort of situation where you tell your friends about the creepy guy on the way to work, but I quickly forgot about it and moved on. A week later, I'm walking back from work to the station, ready to get the train home, and annoyingly, all of the trains are cancelled that evening, for some reason. This is an inconvenience, but because I only live a stop away, I can quite easily get a lift home. I call my mum and she agrees to pick me up once she finishes shopping in around an hour. No biggie. Because all the trains have been cancelled, the station is incredibly busy. There are at least 100 people inside, standing and just sitting around waiting. Luckily, as soon as I walked in, I found a spare seat and sat down. But it was the sort of busy where every seat was taken. I put my AirPods in and just listened to music, wanting to get the ride in an hour. After around 5 minutes of being sat, the person next to me gets up, and another person comes to sit down. I don't even look up from my phone because people are bustling around everywhere. After another 2 or 3 minutes, I feel a tap on my shoulder, and lo and behold, it's the guy from last week. He has chosen to sit right next to me. I fake an uneasy smile, and we chat bluntly for about a minute before I put my headphones back in and close him off. The whole time I'm looking down at my phone and he's shamelessly staring right at me, which makes me feel quite uneasy. After around 40 minutes, he taps me again and asks me how I'm getting home. I tell him my lift will be here any minute and stand up to go and wait outside for my mum, as she had texted me that she was around the corner. The man stands up and says, "Oh, okay, good. I guess I'll go get in my taxi then." At this point I'm like, what? Why is he waiting here all this time for a train then? "Oh, you're not waiting around," I say to him, and he straight up turned to me and said, "No, I'm getting a cab. I was just waiting to make sure you got home safe," with the creepiest smile, as if he expected me to be grateful for it. I note my way out of there ASAP, and luckily my mum had just pulled me up to take me home. I'm telling her the whole story of this absolute weirdo, and as I'm telling her I get a notification on my phone. I look down and my blood ran cold. He had just sent me a friend request on Facebook. I had only told him my first name, and even then my name on Facebook is 1 letter different to my name I gave him. My place of work isn't listed on my profile, so he couldn't have been able to find me from that. And even so, why would you add my personal Facebook account? I haven't actually seen him since then, and I'm so glad that I haven't. I'm hyper aware on my morning commute now and constantly looking out for him. So, that's my creepy train stalker story, and I really hope not to meet him again. When I was 17, I got a job working for a major thrift store chain in North Seattle, a location considered by many to be sketchy. The MO of this chain was to buy up old grocery stores or other serviceable old buildings and open up stores. The building was, I believe, one of the old grocery stores of the area. It was tiny and very old. I had made a few friends while working there, most of whom I'm still friends with today, and recently this was brought back up. It blows my mind I could have forgotten this because it's the only actual tangible evidence I've ever seen with my own 2 eyes of real paranormal activity. Here's what went down. One night after everyone went home, the security alarm went off. That flagged the security company to send a police car and to inform the building owners. So on and so forth down the chain of command until it landed at my friend, the store's supervisor's, feet. Since he lived within walking distance of the store, he was responsible for meeting with the patrol and verifying that the building was all clear. And it was. With that taken care of, everyone went about their business. The next day, he obviously checked the security footage to see what might have set off the alarm. He actually called me and a few others into the office to show us the footage. Let me describe the layout for you, so you can get a better mental image of this first. The front of the store was an entire wall of floor-to-ceiling windows with 3 doors. An entrance, an exit, and an emergency exit with a big red handle that would trip the alarm if used. The registers stood between that front wall and the racks of clothing, with each rack having a little end cap sign on a little metal post. If you've thrift shopped, I'm sure you know what they look like, as it's pretty much the same in every shop. The back part of the store, the employee-only area, had a bunch of racks of clothing waiting to be priced that sat there for the next morning. So he showed us this CCTV footage. It's dark, it's empty, and nothing seems to be happening for a minute. Then, one of the end cap signs starts to slowly spin. This I could easily write off as a vent draft or something, but things started picking up. The CCTV would pan back and forth between the camera, overlooking the front windows / registers / partial view of the racks, and end cap signs to the back of the housing area where we processed all donations. In the back, you could see the sleeve of a coat being lifted, as though it were being pinched at the cuff and lifted above the collar before being dropped again, over and over. That could not be explained by a draft. Back to the front camera. The sign is now spinning extremely fast, and the crappy cardboard signs that hang with fishing line from the ceiling are swaying like crazy, almost like an earthquake. And then, the glass window actually started flexing violently. The red handle on the emergency exit door, a long metal bar, almost as long as the actual door at the front, thrusted up and down, while the whole door and surrounding windows looked like they were being wailed on by someone, or several somebodies. This is what set the alarm off. There was no one there. The parking lot was visible through the glass, and there was not a single person in that entire place. All the activity started very slowly and ramped up into a somewhat violent frenzy, and then just stopped. All within maybe a 1 to 2 minute span. So I have no proof, but it's very frustrating, as the footage has been lost. But I can't think of any logical explanation for any of it. I'm flawed, and I will never be able to forget what I've seen. And that was the better part of a decade ago now. This dream has stayed with me, and I think it always will. Although not profound or life-altering, I've never been able to shake the memory and the feeling of absolute terror and dread. To give some context, this was a number of years ago. Currently, I'm 23 years old, and this dream occurred at the age of 11. As a child, I suffered from sleep paralysis for a number of years. At first, this terrified me to the point of me not wanting to sleep. It became so bad that I pushed myself to states of exhaustion before my body could no longer remain conscious and I would pass out, only to return to the horrifying imagery of my subconscious. The first time I ever experienced sleep paralysis, I still lived with my aunt who fostered me, which is another story entirely. But I was in my old room in my old bunk bed, and I remember it all so clearly. I awake to the sensation of not being able to move, struggle as I may, and this confused me, but didn't scare me, not yet. It was only when I saw what stood in the corner of the room did my fear really start to descend. It was a hooded figure, all black, so very black, darker than the darkest shade of black. In its hand was some kind of weapon, like an oddly shaped axe or scythe. Its face was that of a skeleton, ghostly white, and dark black holes that felt as though they were sucking the life straight out of you, where his eyes should have been. It stood there, staring at me. My eyes widened as I prayed for this to be some kind of dream or hallucination. I was frozen in fear, not that I could escape, even if I had the courage to move. Its sharp, crooked, daggered teeth began to form a smile, the most gut-wrenching, heart-stopping smile I could ever imagine. The kind of smile that alludes to such confidence, such domination and power over me, that it only frightened me more and intensified my fear. It slowly, creakily, almost clockwork doll-like, began to turn its head, continuing until it was such at an unnatural angle, and then it started to inch towards me. It didn't walk. It simply began to move closer. It didn't obey any natural law or any flicker of logic. I guess in retrospect it makes perfect sense, just adding to my confusion. It edged even closer to me, unmoving and unchanging in its deadlock, icy grin, its gaze of absolute horror still peering into my soul. Looking back, I can still picture it, and it disgusts me. It continued until it was halfway across the room. Then, without warning, it just stopped. This is where my blood ran cold. It slowly raised its arms from beneath its cloak to reveal its hideous, revolting arm, a mixture of rotting flesh on bone, decomposing right there in front of me, and the sight of it made me want to gag. Then it did something I'll never forget. It methodically raised its hand slowly, that putrid thing, and began to point, not at something in the room, but at me. My eyes widened further still, and my heart began to thump in my chest. It then placed both hands upon his head and began to twist and pull his head back into place. The noise sent shivers down my spine. It creaked and cracked and screamed back into place, and then the figure began to approach me. It was at this point full-blown panic set in, and I started to struggle. I kicked and twisted and tried to throw my body, but I could not. I couldn't move. I was trapped and paralyzed as the ominous creature drew ever closer. I couldn't free my invisible shackles. So I screamed with all my might. I thought at the very least my family would be alerted. At the very least, they'd surely see what happened to me, for whatever small comfort that may bring. But to my dismay, no sound came from my mouth. I tried again, but now the figure was almost at the foot of my bed. My cries for help failed. In my head, I was screaming like a madman. The figure was now at the foot of my bed, only now it's not smiling, but it looks more terrifying, teeth all aligned jaggedly. I continued to struggle, but it was futile. It continued to get closer and closer until it was stood right in front of me at the side of my bed. I was frozen. I just looked back at it, petrified. It leaned in until its face was face to face with me, and at this point I knew my life was over. It reached its arm towards me, and it screamed a blood-curdling scream. I closed my eyes and prepared myself to be ripped apart by this thing. But no. Nothing. Just like that, it was gone. I look around my room with my heart thumping so hard I thought it would burst from my ribcage. I was sweating profusely, and I was afraid. I scanned the room, but it was empty. I turned on the light. Nothing. I crawled back into bed, confused and fearful. No more sleep was had the next night, and the light remained on. The previous night's ordeal haunted me the next day, and I couldn't focus. I tried to talk with my aunt, but she put it down to a bad dream, maybe a demon that had taken a liking. The latter was her way of trying to be funny and reassure me that it wasn't real, but I didn't find it comforting in the slightest. In fact, it made me more paranoid, and I dreaded going back to bed that night. When night came, I wasn't prepared, and I decided I wouldn't sleep in fear of what I saw returning. I tried my hardest, but eventually my struggles resulted in failure. It was no good. My eyes became heavy and tears started to stream down my face. Whatever that thing was had shaken me to my very core. It might sound silly to some, but I genuinely believed that when I fell back asleep, my life would be in serious danger. I sobbed and cried myself to sleep, and the next morning I awoke and I was fine. No figure, no traumatic experience at all. And this filled me with so much joy than ever before. Maybe it had just been a dream. Maybe I didn't have to face this thing. It was exhilarating. Later on, I would learn about sleep paralysis, as I did end up suffering from it for quite a few years, and ended up doing some research which confirmed it to be nothing more than sleep-related hallucinations. Even when they would return several times as I returned to sleep, eventually I did discover something useful, something to help you escape, even if it's just temporarily. The trick is to move. I know you probably think, well, that's useful considering you're legitimately paralyzed, hence the name sleep paralysis, but there's something many people fail to consider. Yes, it's true you can't move your arms or legs or even your head. You can't scream or make a sound, but what you can do is move your tongue. It sounds silly, but move your tongue as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And if you try and waggle those fingertips and toes at the same time, you'll wake up much faster. Maybe there's someone hearing this who's suffering from sleep paralysis. Maybe there's people listening who already know this and don't believe it would work. But if you're suffering, and the once tranquil thought of sleep has been replaced with the fear of what awaits you, then give it a try. It may just help. This happened a little before my 20th birthday, about 4 to 5 months ago. It was about 5 p.m. and I was waiting for a friend at a bar, and he was running a little late. So I went ahead and got my first drink while waiting. As I was sitting at the bar, a guy came up and started talking to me. Definitely nothing to worry about yet. It was a bar and he definitely seemed like he was just trying to pick me up. We had a light conversation and he offered to buy me a drink, and I accepted. He called the bartender and I ordered. We spoke for a little, exchanged numbers, and I told him I was waiting for a friend, and he asked if she was as pretty and unique as me. Being an alternative girl, guys never really know how to compliment. I laughed and said no. He is definitely prettier, and with almost perfect timing, my friend messaged me that he was there but couldn't see me. I told him I was sitting in the end corner of the bar, and he came to find me. I gave my friend a hug and introduced the two. The guy started to act a little strange now, saying that he didn't want to interrupt our night and being kind of standoffish. He said he had to go and just up and left. I wondered if maybe he was intimidated by my friend because he's 6'4" but is also lanky. I had his number and thought I'd message him tomorrow. I had a nice night with my friend. We had some drinks and then went to get a few more drinks. About 11ish, it was time to say goodbye, and we walked to the train station because we live in different areas and took different trains. His showed up before mine. We said our final goodbyes and I waved him off. I had another 10 or so minutes before grabbing my own train, so I just took out my phone and browsed my socials. This is when I got the feeling that I was being watched. I look around and see no one looking at me, and since I was in the city, even though it was kind of late, people were still about. So I went back to my browsing and had someone sit down next to me. "Thought it was you," the voice said. I looked up and was surprised to see the guy from the bar. I asked if he was also heading home, and he said he was, and that he needed to feed his cat. As a cat person, I asked more about that, and he showed me pictures. He asked if I wanted to come home and feed and see her too. I told him maybe some other time, and he was pretty insistent, but I still refused. My train was coming and I stood to go wait for it. As I was about to turn and say goodbye, he was standing as well. He said he was taking the same train, and at this point I was a little suspicious. But it was a main train, so we got on and I sat down again, and he sat next to me. I had to get off in 2 stops, then get on another train for another 2 stops. And he got off also at the same stop, and on the same train again. The whole time having normal conversations with me. Obviously I was freaking out a little, so I messaged my housemate and asked him to wait for me at the station. Luckily him and his missus were still up, and he asked me why, and I told him to just do it. When we got off at the station that was only a short walk from my apartment, I said it was a funny coincidence that he also lived around here. He turned to me and said, "No, you're taking me to your place." I apologized if he had misunderstood me, but I never had said anything like that. He said that he was already all this way, and that I should just let him come over. Like he was ordering me around. It all felt gross. At this point, I was in full-on panic mode. There weren't that many people at this stop, and we were in a suburban neighborhood now. This is probably when I looked noticeably panicked, and my housemate saw this and came out of the car. He's 29 and quite a big guy. He came over and in his Lebo accent asked if there was a problem, and the guy said that he was my date and that I was taking him home. I said that was a lie, and my housemate just walked me to the car, and I mean mugged the guy the whole time. Sitting in the car, I got a text. It said, "I'll see you again." I had totally forgotten that I gave him my number. I looked up to see him still standing at the station. We locked eyes, and he smiled and waved. It wasn't a creepy smile. It looked nice and genuine, and I think that is what made it creepier. I avoid that bar now, and would rather not see him again. This is something that happened to me in 2014, about 2 weeks after my dad passed away. I am a 39-year-old female, originally from Miami, Florida, and I've been living in the Hudson Valley area of New York for about 6 years, when in February of 2014, my 59-year-old seemingly fit and seemingly healthy father was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer that had spread to his liver. I was devastated. As being a registered nurse, I knew there was no hope. My dad decided to take the chemotherapy treatment against his better judgment because my mum, brother, and myself were so distraught that we begged him to try as we prayed for a miracle. After 7 months of feeling sick and making little to no progress as had been expected, my dad, mum, and the doctor came to the decision my dad would be placed on a hospice, and it was time for me to fly back home and spend my dad's last days with him at the house and surrounded by our large and supportive extended family. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to tell my father how much I loved him and what a perfect father he had always been to me. 2 days of being on hospice care, all around the clock morphine, my dad fell into an almost coma-like state, where he would not open his eyes and barely moved. The next 5 days were full of anxiety, sadness, and at times desperation. We didn't want to lose him, but we didn't want for him to suffer anymore. Finally, after 7 days of being home on hospice, on a beautiful and sunny Miami day, my dad passed away surrounded by family. I was always extremely close to my dad, and at that moment, it was surreal for me. I let out the pain and emotions I had been keeping in for the past week, in the form of loud, anguished sobs as I hugged his dead body and kissed his face and head. My dad was gone. About a week later, after ensuring my mum and younger brother were okay, as could be expected, I flew back to New York, as I had work and my children and husband needed me. I was in a fog of sadness and disbelief as I tried to get back to my routine. 2 weeks after my dad's passing, I found myself in a dream where my mum and brother and I were walking in an indoor place with lots of people from different parts of the world walking around and talking to each other. There was a river that ran through the place, and I and my mum and brother followed it until it reached a bend, and upon trying right to continue following it, my dad appears in front of us. He looked young, healthy, and radiantly glowing. His beautiful green eyes were healthy again, so bright, and I yelled in absolute joy, "Dad, I miss you so much." We hugged and then began to speak telepathically, not using words. It's a bit difficult to explain, but basically our communication was entirely through feelings and in our mind, but no words were exchanged. I simply understood what he was conveying to me, and he understood me the same way. This is what he expressed to me. "I don't look like this anymore. I came to you in this way so that you'd recognize me. I knew the family was all there, but I missed my brother. Tell Jay that not all of them are good and to not give his light to just anyone." It's important to understand here that my dad's brother was not present during my father's last 2 days because he was in prison and wasn't due to be released for at least another year. The two had grown up very close because they had been abandoned on the family farm in Cuba to be raised by relatives as my grandmother moved to Havana to start a new life. Regarding Jay, he's my little brother and my dad's youngest son. He had been doing drugs and spending time with bad people, and although we didn't know the extent of his involvement in this type of lifestyle, we knew he was potentially in danger. Although smart and spunky, Jay has always been kind-hearted and sees the best in others, so he's an easy target for malicious people to take advantage of. After communicating with my dad for a bit, his late mother, my grandmother who passed away a year earlier, came into the dream with desperation and urgency. I didn't want to speak with her, but she insisted I had to listen because she had things to say to the family. I looked at my dad sadly, and he communicated that he could not stay and could not communicate with me anymore because she was there. Apparently she was stronger than him. He was gone. Despite her insistence and desperation, I didn't listen to my grandmother except to learn that she was trapped in a place and needed to move on. I did not try to help or listen further as my dad was gone. I woke up. I had an intense feeling that this was not a dream, and now 5 years later I remember the dream vividly, and the feeling that this was a real communication with my dad and, unfortunately, my grandmother. I believe my dad wanted to let me know he was okay, but I also got the feeling that he was very new in the place where he was and not yet strong enough to truly hold his own there. I believe he had an opportunity to speak with me and took it. I've had dreams of him in the last few years, but never one like that. I love and miss my dad every day. To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7, so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big sellers around here is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the stations in the city. My story begins when I was working overnights in a gas station/liquor store when I was doing part-time classes in college but mostly doing classes online, so they wouldn't ruin my availability for a full-time job. The store that I worked at had only one person working overnights for a long time, even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into a liquor store/gas station in the middle of the night. The owner's hand was forced one night, because I started working there, that a woman who came in to buy milk went outside to her car, only for a man to come up behind her and shove a gun to her back demanding her money. She complied with him and luckily he let her go. She ran into the store, sobbing hysterically, and though police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally prefer having two people on, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The nights seemed to go by so much quicker when there was someone else there, and it was really nice that the person I normally closed with, and I got along with so well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and really was only working there as a favor to one of the managers, so she would only work 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. Josh and I worked together 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh and I 2 nights a week. Dixie was really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't really particularly like the job or want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a bit different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with one person for more than a week. No one seemed to really like him or enjoyed working with him. Nick was a little off from the start. He was one of those people who told you his entire life story as soon as you met him, giving a bunch of really personal details that no one really wants to know or feels comfortable hearing. One thing he always seemed to talk about was the strain on his marriage. Apparently, he had had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed. But he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, but you kind of get used to some people in that kind of job being sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months, when Nick's stories seemed to escalate out of nowhere. He began telling people that when he was younger, he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he had to take a bunch of pills for it every day so he wouldn't become violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, but okay. We all have our problems, and some people get dealt a bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I myself always struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I wouldn't be killing people by any means. I'd probably be hospitalized in danger to self categories, so as creepy as that was, I assured him that a lot of people needed to take medication for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick to it and are honest with medical professionals, there's no reason you can't still do anything anyone else can do. He seemed pleased with this answer, and soon after the subject was turned to other things. He was especially cheery and nice to me after that for the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and felt like things were going well with him. I always answered enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wish he would stop talking to me about it and would leave me alone. Josh had a wife and a daughter who was 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but see us younger girls through the eyes of what his daughter might potentially have to deal with when she was our age, and seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I was grateful for, and didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick. It wasn't before long, Nick started conversations with me, going into details about why he was diagnosed, instead of how his medicine was working, which I won't get into here because a lot of it is very violent. I told him repeatedly that I didn't want to know about that, to which he would act like he misunderstood and changed the subject only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided to Dixie about it, she told me that she would take care of it and told her friend, which was the manager who asked her to come work there. The manager couldn't really do much since I seemed to be the only one that he would talk to about these things, and told me to come to her again if he made me feel uncomfortable. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working there. After he was talked to by the manager, and soon after 2 other women who worked with him on the night shift reported comments he made to them to the manager. I was questioned, in which I agreed that all of the statements made by the women were similar to things that had been said to me. Nick was given a final warning and a write-up. The next few times I saw him, he would go on rants about how people there were only reporting him because they didn't like him. I assumed he didn't know that I had been questioned too, and neither Josh and I had any intention of telling him. He got so angry at one point that he practically was in tears, saying how lucky those twats were, that he was on his meds, and what he would do to them if he was not. Fortunately, it was about that point that his shift ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we didn't really have time to chat. He nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had come extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do, unless they absolutely had to, was stocking the drink coolers. It is true that they're easier to do at night, but when there were a lot less customers, so it was annoying since we couldn't chat. But we went with it, and I can't remember the time that Josh went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late since we had been there a while. At that point, I was still focused on stocking the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it, when the bell chimed signaling someone had come in. I threw out a good evening and I'll be right there, since anyone that comes in that late usually only wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for gas in cash. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it. There was Nick, not looking at me but leaning next to my register. I'd be lying if I said I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out he was drunk, but I couldn't detect it right away from the smell of booze that always seemed to linger in the air around there, and Josh was right on the other side of the wall. Even so, I considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go, or if I should run into the cooler and get Josh. Nick wasn't a young, fit guy or anything. Years of drugs and drinking had aged him prematurely and ruined his body, but he was still intimidating to a 20-year-old girl. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, turned towards me, and that's when I noticed immediately that there was something off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He just stared at me, nothing on his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring. "He leave you here alone?" It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopeful, steady voice that Josh was in the cooler and asked if he wanted me to get him. Again, staring at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said. I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was creeping me out. I asked with more force in my voice, "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I stopped speaking, he grinned at me in a disgusting, almost singing voice. "You're lying. You're alone." He laughed and took a step towards me, but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps back. At this point, I should have run to Josh. I should have called for him. Anything. But I couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. Nick was really weird, but I had never felt an actual danger around him before. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow, stumbling steps, telling me to come here and that he just wanted to talk. I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I could hurt him if I had to. He thought that was particularly amusing and laughed loudly enough that Josh told me later that was what caused him to look through the spaces of the racks and see what was going on. Josh was out the door in a second and seemed to come out of nowhere, shoving himself in between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything, just stared at each other down before Josh said in a stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick stared blankly for a moment, then scoffed, telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there, and he somehow had caught me, I would have stood no chance against him. Josh left me standing, with my back against the wall, coralining Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both our parts, Nick turned and took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because Josh was drunk or really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face, and Josh grabbed the back of his coat and brought him down as he smashed his knee into Nick's stomach, and used the opportunity of his spluttering to drag him to the door and throw him out, locking it. Josh had just turned and told me to call the cops as we heard this sickening crack behind him. We both jumped up and looked at the door to find this big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie or an actual car wreck, when something hits a windshield but not hard enough to break through and it just turns all white around the point of impact, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do. I ran to the register, grabbed my phone, going to the corner furthest away from the front door, and huddled on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time he noticed that Nick had a hunting knife in his other hand. The fact that he had tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so hard. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background, with loud smashes of Nick hitting the door, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address, because just as I got up to look at the receipt to see what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor and she told me that officers were already on their way, and to do whatever I could to get away or hide, even if I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, and he had made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and throwing it at the part of the window he had been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it to break through though. From that hole he could only reach the lock on the door. According to Josh, he walked to the door and put his mouth against the hole that he had formed and said something that I'm sobbing right now even thinking about it, in that horrible sing-song voice that he used the first time I spoke to him that night. He said in such a happy tone, "They're never going to find you two." Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was crapping bricks as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole and wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh slammed his body into it, knocking Nick backwards from the impact. Josh yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, I ran right behind him to the receiving doors in the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling at us as the door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain, as he realized it wouldn't open. We later found out that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it against us before he came in. We seemed to both realize at once that he actually planned this. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me some time to slam the back room door shut and lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut. When Nick reached it, he must have heard me crying, because he kept calling out my name, telling me it wasn't me he wanted. He would make sure that I passed before I even felt the pain if I opened the door. He then started stabbing the door, screaming at me to open it. I screamed and moved when he stabbed it the first time, but Josh and I both moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. I had dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to get to it, so we had no idea how long until the police got there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't last long against his body slams and offered no protection if his knife went into one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to pass here, that my dog would never know why I never came home, that I would never get my degree, that I have enough money to actually start life, that all of the plans for my future, my girlfriend and I, would never happen. In the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly went silent. There were no police, car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both slammed to the ground when a gunshot went off at once, then twice, then a third time. There was more silence. Then a voice rang out asking if anyone was here. We weren't sure if we should say something. Then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed the things aside in front of the door, opening it just enough to put his head out. And then it seemed like the breath just left him. He opened the door and went out into the store, relief all over him. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer was, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but they were all pretty far away, and he had a horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police got there, because though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said he would run after him, but with the state the store was in, he was scared that someone in there could be hurt or dying. The next 20 minutes were a blur. Josh and I were sitting on the floor hugging each other when the police got there. The EMT had called dispatch and told them of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were diverted to look for Nick. It was soon after that that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife and she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got home and came in to see my dog's body wiggling excitedly, proudly displaying his flamingo toy for me as a welcome gift. Nick was found 2 weeks later in an old RV in the woods that he had been using to do his drinking and drugs in so that his wife wouldn't catch him. Apparently the reason that he had come after us was because he thought that the reason that Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so that he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had kicked him out 4 days before this happened and was in the process of getting a restraining order against him over threatening texts and phone calls she had been receiving. He stated that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him. He said that I wasn't the target, and he didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of ending Josh's life with me there than Dixie there, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh or I called the owner or even a manager over his comments that night, though maybe we should have. In hindsight, it was disturbing what he was saying, but we were so used to him being a creep and saying really horrible things at that point that it didn't even register to us that he could seriously be thinking about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months, and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent towards anyone. Everyone just thought he was all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee had a background check on them before they were hired, so it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. He took a plea deal so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped, and he would go instead to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason that I'm sharing this story now, other than the other stories on this subreddit inspiring me, is that I got a call 2 weeks ago notifying me that as long as there is no setbacks to his health status, Nick is set to be released on June 8th of this year, Mort's birthday. When I called Josh, he said that he had received the same news that day. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city, and I have switched to going to college completely online, and am now in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. I don't think he'll come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I've heard so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone seems so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I don't think I'll be any more prepared to face him this time than I was back then. I've had pretty intense nightmares ever since that day. But ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence louder and clearer than I ever have heard it since it was actually said. They're never going to find you two. Nick, if it was true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I don't feel safe, especially at night. I don't believe in God, but I pray to anyone that's listening that we never meet again. This is the most terrifying and vivid dream I've ever experienced, and was a few years ago. I was in my sister's hometown because she was in the hospital, so her room as well as her roommate's room was empty. My parents stayed in her room while I stayed in the roommate's. We'd been there for a few days and I had no previous issues up until then. I was laying on her bed watching TV. on the phone with my boyfriend and overall drifting off since it was late. I could faintly hear him snoring on the other end of the phone, and I too, myself, felt like I was drifting. I vividly remember what apparently was a dream that felt very real. I was in an unknown house getting out of the bathtub. I walked past the hallway and to the room to sit and watch TV. Everything was normal for a few minutes, when out of the corner of my eye I saw movement. I turned, seeing the long hallway of this unfamiliar house. The light above it was flickering, like it would in a typical scary movie. I ignored it and looked back to the show I was watching, but again saw something with my peripherals. I turned quicker this time, thinking I'd be able to catch whatever it was before it disappeared again, and I saw a tall dark figure, but it wasn't a person. I was immediately filled with fear and dread. I was frozen for what seemed like hours. The light began flickering in longer bursts. It would shut off completely, then light back on for a brief second. And every time it did this, the thing would move closer to me. The light would illuminate it closer than the previous time, and I jumped off the couch and tried opening the door to escape, but no matter how hard I tried, the door just wouldn't open. I was scratching and clawing to no avail. I could sense this thing behind me. I knew it was there, but I was too afraid to turn and see it face to face. I was completely filled with fear. I felt something hot on the back of my neck and heard a mumbling, though I couldn't make out what was being said. I collapsed to my knees, still clawing at the door, this thing looming over me even if I didn't see it. I knew it and felt it. Suddenly my eyes opened and I was back in my sister's townhouse, but unable to move. I was awake again, but in what I can only describe as sleep paralysis. Movement drew my eyes to the right side of the bed, and I could see curtains moving. My mind tried rationalizing it. The fan? No, it was off. Was it the window? No, I never opened it. Again I sensed movement from the curtains. Something was pushing through it, getting closer to me. I could see the outline of a very tall person like the figure in my dream. My brain was screaming for me to get up and run, but my body wasn't cooperating. The curtain pulled off this thing, and I was face to face with it. I wanted to shut my eyes, look away, anything to not see it, but I couldn't even shut my eyes. It was in the shape of a man. As I said previously, it was very tall and skinny, and it was inky black, the blackest black you can imagine. It had no features, no clothes, nothing. It had no eyes, but I felt like it was staring at me. I was in full panic mode at this point. I saw a flicker of color, and suddenly I realized I was staring into a pair of glowing red eyes. We held contact for what seemed like hours, when I felt movement in my body again. I snapped out of it, jumped out of the bed and ran down the hall to my sister's room where my parents were asleep. I knocked frantically on their door, calling for my mum. The knocking turned to pounding, and my call turned to yelling for my parents to let me in. I never turned back towards the room. I was too afraid to see those eyes peering through the doorway or seeing it stalking me. They opened the door, confused at the sight of their 22-year-old daughter crying and screaming in the middle of the night. They questioned me, but I made up a lie, as I knew they'd think I was having a nightmare or I was just exaggerating. I told them that I thought someone was trying to break in through the window, but that didn't make sense either since we were on a second story, but I stuck to it. My dad went to check and of course found nothing. Needless to say, I opted to sleep in the floor of their room with my parents for the rest of our stay. I don't know what it was and I can't explain it, but it was definitely a traumatizing experience that I still struggle with. Did I get a visit from a shadow person, ghost, demon? Or was it just all a dream? When working security, we had to check the interior of this empty building that was at one point a knockoff of JCPenney. So many mannequins in there randomly posed. I answered a door dispatched to the building. It's raining outside. I head in and clear the corner to find every mannequin in the hallway. I backed out of that place and called 10-8 as I'm closing the doors, and I swore I could see one moving. I changed to a different patrol area after that. No freaky mannequin murders for me. To start the story off, for context, I absolutely despise bugs of all kind. Oh, of course, I loved them as a child, but over the years, from being bitten by every local bug imaginable, I began to despise them. Since I was raised in the South, I had fallen victim to fire ants, and I seem to give off a certain scent that attracts every mosquito and flea from miles around. But what did I hate the most? Roaches. Such disgusting creatures, the way they look, the way they move. Safe to say I had an intense phobia of them. I inherited a house from my dead grandmother in my late teens, and since it had been abandoned for about a year. That's right, you guessed it. It had become infested with large water bugs. Sleeping in the house was a nightmare, since occasionally the bugs found their way onto my bed. I could even hear them crawling in the walls at night. To cut a long story short, I went to extreme measures to eliminate them from my new home, and the war lasted a few years at least. One night after spraying and fighting with these pests, I retired for the night, thoroughly creeped out. That night I went to bed and had one of the most vivid and disturbing nightmares of my entire life. I remember that me and my family were traveling, and we couldn't find a motel. This was a common occurrence with my family anyway, and they usually would wait until late at night only to find run-down cheap motels. After arguing what to do, we came across an abandoned-looking building, and my family decided that this was where we were going to stay. I guess because it was free? I voiced my complaints, but their decision was adamant. As we walked inside, it ended up being my old apartment building from childhood, except the entire place was in ruins, as if hundreds of years had passed and the building was barely left standing. Deep cracks could be seen all over the walls, as well as large holes in the flooring. Dirt was everywhere, and both small patches of grass and vines were beginning to invade the building through these holes. I remember wondering just what in the hell happened to this place, since it did carry sentimental value after all. An overall feeling of depression and dread could be felt in every room as I explored, like some sort of curse had taken over these walls. When I went into what was my old bedroom, I saw the haunting image of my original bed as a child still there, except it was just as dirty as the rest of the apartment. The rest of the apartment is empty, but what is my bed still doing here, I wondered. I did my best to shake the dust from the sheets since we were apparently stuck sleeping here. I complained a few more times, but my father shouted and insisted that I lay down and close my eyes, so I did. I don't remember any form of electricity being in the apartment, but suddenly everything went dark. Only a dim glow could be seen emanating from moonlight shining through the holes and cracks in the walls. Suddenly, small bugs could be felt crawling on me. I wasn't surprised by this at all considering the environment, so I just shook them off and tried to ignore it. This kept happening, and eventually, I had had enough. I jumped out of bed only to discover a far worse situation that I could imagine. Bugs everywhere. Green caterpillars all over the floor, spiders, and of course roaches everywhere too. I lost my mind. I ran into the other room with my parents, screaming that I wanted to leave now. At first they ignored me, but as these large bugs that I had never seen before began emerging from the cracks, emitted a screeching sound, they finally jumped up and decided it was time to leave as well. We packed our things as fast as we could, but when we went to the exit, a large group of screaming roaches approached our way. We weren't able to get through them. They moved with lightning speed as they ran all over the room, in and out of the cracks. One of the strange bugs I couldn't identify earlier bit me, and I let out a scream as I stomped on it, turning it into a pile of goo. Several more approached us, and all I can say is that they appeared like praying mantises, but different. We had no other choice but to fight. We went around stomping on whatever got close to us, while fighting off some of the flying bugs with our hands, and still occasionally getting bitten in the process. A swarm of flying bugs surrounded my face and I fell backwards while trying to fight them off. That was when I saw what I can truly say was the most horrifying image I'd ever seen. I sat up and saw a large, roundish centipede-like creature emerging from a large hole. The creature was red and not nearly as long as any normal centipede, but still had many legs. The creature crawled onto a large rock, and as its backside was visible, I saw the human face of an old man on its back. The human face was actually part of the creature, centered with dozens of legs attached to the side of its face. The face looked right at me, and its expression was contorted in pain as it made a light screeching sound, the same sound that someone makes when they're being choked, as if it had been human at one point and was left doomed to spend the rest of its life and existence in agony on this creature's back. Thankfully, I immediately woke up after this, but felt very disturbed. I couldn't get the image out of my mind for weeks. And since I'm an artist, I feel the need to paint that image onto canvases. I think it's a way of me confronting my fear. Even as I painted this, I felt the image come into place. A true déjà vu feeling. The picture hangs on my bedroom, and as time passed, I am no longer afraid of it. It has become my favorite of all my art creations, and the one I am most proud of. Something that truly came out of my head, and mine alone. This happened over a year ago now, when I was 17. I quite often get the train into London to visit my boyfriend. I go up on the Friday or Saturday and come back Sunday evening. My parents always told me, and quite rightly, to try and get an early train home on Sunday, in order to avoid travelling late by myself, but me being naive and stupid, always accidentally missed the earlier trains, in order to spend time with my boyfriend. This particular Sunday, I was getting a train that got into the station where I lived at around 9 p.m. My station is the last stop on the line, and where the train terminates, so by the end of the journey, it is always relatively empty. Sometimes I'm the only one getting off aside from the guard. Usually I would just put in noise-cancelling headphones, settle down and zone out of whatever was happening around me. I'm quite an anxious traveller, so blocking out the sound helps me relax. I also try and sit at the end of a carriage where there aren't as many people, as having lots of people around can make me more susceptible to anxiety attacks. After this evening, I always made sure to sit near people. I'm sitting with my headphones on, tucked away with my suitcase in the footwell of the seat next to me, and a pair of seats next to a window sitting in the window seat, when I notice a man stumble into the seats adjacent to mine across the aisle. He leans across the seats, looks directly at me, and mumbles something to me. He was wearing all black, a massive black coat, and had a big duffel bag. I'm a little anxious because I'm not the biggest fan of talking to strangers. I take off my headphones and politely ask him to repeat himself. His speech is slurred, making what he is saying completely incoherent, but after he's repeating himself several times, I realize he's asking if I know if there are any taxi companies at my station. I say no, sorry, and put my headphones back in. He leans over again and asks me the same question. I take my headphones off and give him the same reply. No, I don't know of any. Sorry. He says something else. I ask him to repeat himself because his speech is so slurred I can't understand him. This strange conversation persists for about 20 minutes. I can't understand much of what he is saying. He is sort of half mumbling, half speaking, and he's not really making much sense. He keeps asking me how I'm getting home and where I live. I just say by car, and don't say anything about where I live. I'm super nervous now because this guy just gave me the creeps. I had a feeling something bad was going to happen, and he's starting to make me feel uncomfortable. There was just this vibe about him, that he was bad news. He then asks me if I'm going to call the police on him, and I say no, and he starts mumbling and swearing profusely, saying something about beating my brains in, and at this point I'm really starting to freak out. All of a sudden he moves across the aisle to sit in the seat next to mine, trapping me in my seat. I can't escape. I'm sitting next to the window and he's completely blocking the aisle. I'd have to awkwardly climb over him in order to leave. I've decided he must be high or drunk, because his eyes look absolutely crazed and his speech is so slurred. He tells me that I'm very beautiful and asks if I have a boyfriend, moving closer until I could feel his breath on my face. I look around to see if there's anyone in the carriage with me, but I can't see anyone. He leans in really close, and I'm freaking out now. But luckily the train guard comes through from the next carriage, sees me looking very scared and comes over to ask if everything's okay. Immediately this guy's demeanor changes. He leans away from me, and he waves his hand as if to say nothing is wrong. I say yes, everything is okay. But by the look on the face of the guard, he can tell I'm super uncomfortable. The guard makes small talk with the guy and then moves to stand by the door behind us. I don't know what to do. Even though the guard is behind me, I still feel really unsafe, and now I have to get away from this guy. I ask the guy if he would please move back to his seat and say I don't want to talk to him as he's making me feel uncomfortable. He moves back and starts muttering and swearing again, mumbling half-formed threats under his breath. I call my dad, who's picking me up, and when he answers the phone I immediately say, "Hey Dad." The guy looks at me and says, "I'm sorry. I didn't know you had a dad." He tries to talk to me while I'm on the phone. He's talking over me the whole time, but I can't actually make out his words. I have no idea how to try and communicate with my dad that I'm not feeling safe, and this weirdo is talking to me without him overhearing. The train is pulling into the final stop, so I pull my suitcase out of the footwell and try to make a quick exit from the train. The guy gets up very fast and goes in front of me, grabs my suitcase, and takes it off the train, to presumably steal it. I still had my hand on it and managed to pull it back out of his hands. He gets off the train quickly, and I stand next to the guard for a few minutes because I didn't want to get off the train at the exact same time as this guy. The guard asks if I'm alright, and I burst into tears. I'm already anxious and tired, and this may seem like something insignificant, but I suffer with really bad anxiety, and it really creeped me out. A lady comes over. I don't know how she knew I was crying about what happened with this guy, but she must have seen him getting off the train. She says he was asking her about taxis and making her feel uncomfortable until she told him to ask someone else. She apologized for sending him my way, and they both offered to walk me to my car. Luckily, my dad is sitting in the parking lot, and I get in the car safe and sound. There's no sign of where the guy on the train went, and I wish the story would stop there. We make it to a small supermarket on the way home, and usually, my dad would send me in to get whatever we needed, but because I'm still upset from the train, I sit in the car in the deserted parking lot. As soon as my dad enters the supermarket, a car pulls up on the other side of the lot. I see the same guy from the train in the passenger seat, and my blood runs cold. The car he's in isn't a taxi either, which I found strange as that's what he was originally asking me about. I sink down in the car seat a bit, hoping he doesn't see me. But it's like he already knows I'm in the car. He starts pointing at me and talking to the driver. They get out of the car and start walking through the lot towards my car. I immediately lock the doors. My phone is in my bag, which is in the boot, so all I can do is sit there and pray my dad is going to come back at any moment. They've nearly made it to the car when my dad gets back. He was only going in for bread, and they see him and start walking immediately in the other direction towards the supermarket. I yell at my dad to get in the car. I'm crying so hard, and by the time my dad has got into the driver's seat, the men are nowhere to be seen. I managed to calm down enough to tell my dad between sobs about how the guy from the train was in the parking lot in the car with someone else, and that they were walking towards me. I point at the car they were in, and my dad doesn't say much and just starts driving home. When we get home and my mum has managed to calm me down a bit, my dad tells me he noticed the same car driving behind us when we left the station, meaning they must have followed us from the station to the supermarket. I felt really embarrassed, like I was overreacting and making a fuss over nothing, because I'm just oversensitive with bad anxiety. When the guy started talking to me on the train, I felt physically sick, and just had this overwhelming feeling that something bad was going to happen. Even though I have anxiety, I don't usually get these feelings just from speaking to a stranger. But come on, this behavior isn't normal, and I'm pretty sure those guys had far darker intentions for me than we originally thought. When I was a little kid, about 6, I started having this recurring nightmare that follows me still to this day. I'm 17 now for reference. The nightmare took place in a dark castle, the type that you'd see in a horror movie and know instantly it was haunted. I was walking down a corridor of the castle with my mum and sister when we were passing a painting of a tea party. One of the people in the painting, a tall, pale man dressed in all black, stood up and turned to us, beckoning for my mother to follow him. My sister and I tried to stop her, tried to hold her back, but she didn't even seem to notice us. My mother entered the painting and walked further into it, arm in arm with the strange man. My sister and I decided that we needed to find her, but as we searched through the castle, we got separated. I don't know how long I was looking, but I do know that I found my mum, as well as the most traumatizing part of this dream. I stumbled onto the castle's throne room, and it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. The whole room was bathed in red, fiery light that was emanating from a huge fireplace behind the throne that a man from the painting was sitting on, as well as from a gaping hole in the wall that was closing and opening in intervals. There was a huge crowd of people in the throne room. I knew that if they saw me, they would hurt me, so I crept through the shadows on the edge of the throne room until I was just under the hole in the wall. I could hear bits and pieces of conversation from the people gathered around, but nothing made sense. The worst part is that going into the hole in the wall was a conveyor belt style operation, with large metal hooks going down from it, like in a meat processing plant. While that might not be terribly scary, the really messed up part was that hanging from these hooks were all of my loved ones, and they were all alive. To make matters worse, I knew that my family and friends were being drained of their blood and then burnt in that hole. My best friend at the time was just about to go into the fiery hole when he looked directly down at me and gasped, "You caused this," with a look of betrayal and accusation. I was so shocked I couldn't move. As he was being drawn into the hole, I overheard a group of older women laughing and talking about what a shame it was they couldn't get the full set before one of them caught sight of me and grabbed me. It was at that moment I awoke. For the first 2 years after graduating nursing school, I have worked in this nursing home. The things I have experienced at my night shifts have made me believe in the paranormal. I will share my experiences with you. Some are about patients that have recently passed, and a story about a poltergeist haunting me at work. Background. The nursing home itself is only 20 years old and quite modern. There is a large tree yard with all kinds of fruit trees, and there are some water surrounding the property. The nursing home houses about 100 patients. All of these patients have dementia in the later stages of the disease. Because of this, many of the patients pass within the nursing home. Our job as caretakers is to make their lives as enjoyable as possible and bring comfort in the last stages of their lives. An older male patient of my ward developed pneumonia and passed within a week. This man was not able to speak much more. The only things he would say is, "Who can help me?" in a very distinct voice. 5 days later, I had my first of 4 night shifts. A message appeared on my pager that a sensor detected movement in another room at the end of the hallway. When I went to take care of the patient that probably needed a pee, I walked by the room of the deceased male. When I crossed his door, I heard him call in his distinct voice, "Who can help me?" Not being able to think very fast, I planned to take looks at what's going on after I helped the patient from my pager. A few minutes later, I stood within the now empty door from which the deceased called out. Only then I remembered he was to be cremated the next day. Chills went down my spine as I realized. After this experience, I studied a bit more about the paranormal. Many of my more experienced night shift colleagues told me they were experiencing similar events. I also got told about a probable poltergeist who resided in another ward, in a more abandoned room in the other ward. A few months went by and the occasional feeling of being followed occurred. I've also had an experience where the temperature around me would drop drastically and I would suddenly feel freezing. I later found out this could mean there was a ghost present. We had 2 house cats that were always fighting each other in the hallways. Besides that, they are sweet and cuddly pets who spend a lot of time being loved and petted by the patients. These cats would sit at the door of patients that were passing. They didn't make any noise, they just sat there waiting. Sometimes they even tried to sneak into the room of that patient just to sit on their beds. After a few months, I transferred to the ward with the probable poltergeist. The feeling of being watched continued frequently in this ward, and we had many more paranormal occurrences. When a patient passed, sometimes bed sensors would go off randomly in the rooms of these patients. This was frequent to happen after the patient passed, and lasted until they were either buried or cremated, which usually happens a week later here in the Netherlands. My understanding and interest about the paranormal grew, and the more I knew, the more obvious things would happen. Within a month, I experienced another situation like the first experience I described. A patient with a distinctive cry. She always cried, due to illness. She shared a room with another female patient. When I went to check on the woman after the other one had passed, I was about to close the door to the room when the distinctive crying of the deceased woman filled the room. This went on for 5 seconds and then just stopped, and the room was quiet again. Now, the poltergeist I mentioned. The room that he inhabits is number 3, which has something to do with the evil spirits according to Ghost Adventures. The room was used in the times where the nursing home was full of patients to house the terminally ill, as lots of patients passed there. The room kind of fell out of commission when the demand for nursing home beds went down. People that were passing could be nursed in their own homes since there was no longer a waiting list for new patients. The poltergeist would follow me around the ward if I passed the room. When I got an uneasy feeling of being followed, I knew that it was there. Sometimes it would make my emotions go from really angry to being sad to the point I had to fight not to cry. Being a young male, this is abnormal for me. At some point, the sensor of that room would go off, even when there was no one in that room, and the sensor wasn't activated. I never had the guts to go into that room alone, and always asked for backup. A lot of my regular night shift colleagues knew what went on in that room, and would always be very helpful. Sometimes sounds like small knocks on the doors could be heard, or the walls, and I once heard something scratching inside the door. There was also a time I saw a figure standing in the window of room 3. The figure had a human appearance, but was plain black. It really freaked me out. There was one colleague in particular that I would share my experiences with. She was paranormally gifted and could see ghosts, and has the ghost of a small boy in her home. She told me the poltergeist couldn't do anything to me if I didn't let it. The tip she gave me was to speak to the entity and tell it not to bother me, or to leave me alone, and for the most part this did help. Around the time this happened a lot to the irregular night shift colleagues, and they quit because of this. But using the tip I got from my colleague, the night shift became more relaxed to me, and not being stressed out about this cheeky spirit. My theory is that when people pass, their spirits remain within the nursing home, mostly residing in their room or ward. Sometimes they might try to contact people by saying something or making a noise. I don't really know. No one truly does. But after they tend to be buried or cremated, I feel like their spirits move on. When I was 16, my best friend and next-door neighbor ended her life on January 21st, 2006. Every night after that, I would either dream of her entirely, or she would intrude in my other dreams. I remember a dream about a dance recital once where everyone was dancing. She was in the back dancing with a rope around her neck. The dream wasn't about her, but she was there nonetheless. Very unpleasant stuff. It made my grief so much harder to get through. However, it was pretty clear those dreams were just that, dreams. I wasn't frightened, nor was I in any way denying that it was my obvious subconscious thoughts that I dreamed her every single night. On December 31st, 2006, I went to bed. I remember that I dreamed that night that my friend and I were in a field of wildflowers. There was so much sunlight that everything was white, and we were holding hands and she was smiling. We laid down next to each other and I was looking at her. We were silent for a while, and very serenely I asked her, "Were you in pain?" The sound of the field was replaced by this progressive loud ringing until it was so loud my teeth hurt. She answered silently. I watched her face go from smiling to clenching her teeth, turning red, and her face changing until she looked like she was in so much pain. She grasped my hand in hers so hard her fingernails dug into it, and I woke up a few minutes later, turned on the light to see if there was a mark, and of course there wasn't. But that dream felt incredibly different than the others I'd ever had. So vivid, so raw. Point is, I never dreamed of her again after that. I got over her death and put my grief to rest. I'm 27 now, and it's been 12 years. This happened to me about 3 years ago. I was around 15 and have lived in New York City for my entire life, and I like to think that I can handle myself in any situation because I'd seen it all. It was a Friday night, and I was meeting my friend for a 9 o'clock showing of some movie near Times Square. The subway we were on was only half full. I was sitting on the 6 train heading up to Times Square. I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, which wasn't very revealing at all. No makeup, and my hair was kind of a mess, because I figured I was just gonna sit in a dark movie theater for a few hours with one of my best friends, and I didn't really care what other people thought. I was on my phone with my earbuds in, and I noticed a guy across from me just staring at me with this blank expression on his face. I made eye contact with him, smiled politely and looked back at my phone, because I was sitting right across from him, and I thought he must have just zoned out. 5 minutes later I looked back, and he was still staring at me, this time smiling a frankly creepy smile. I smiled again politely, and looked back at my phone, hoping he got the hint, and stopped staring at me. 2 stops passed, and he was still staring. Finally, the man stood up, and I calmed down a bit. By now, the train had gotten pretty crowded since we were approaching Times Square, and there were people in front of me blocking the man from view. Next thing I know, however, the man was standing directly in front of me, with the hand on the pole above me. I was getting pretty paranoid at this point, but the man was on his phone and I thought I was just exaggerating the situation and that I shouldn't overreact. My stop came. I excused myself, pushed past the man without looking at him, and shoved my way through the doors. Even though I thought it was nothing at this point, I was still freaked out at the proximity of this man and his creepy gaze, and something just felt very wrong about the whole situation, so I booked it out of the subway car. I thought I heard a "wait" behind me, but I ignored it because it could have been anybody and kept speed walking. The 42nd Street station is pretty big and complicated, and usually very well crowded. I considered it lucky it wasn't very crowded that day, and as I was a pretty skinny girl and very used to dodging tourists in large crowds since I live in a very popular touristy area, I started weaving through the massive crowd faster than I had before. I stepped onto the first escalator, a bit less nervous, and pulled out my phone when a man walked up to me and stopped on the stair directly behind me. He was so close that I could feel him breathing down my neck, and I glanced behind me to see it was the same man from the subway. He had managed to catch up with me. I have no idea, but that was when I really started to freak out. At the top of the escalator, I broke into the fastest walk I've ever walked, trying to get out of there as fast as I could without looking too distressed. I made it up a few flights of stairs and out of the huge mob of people and started to calm down, thinking again that I was definitely overreacting and that I should just calm down because it was probably nothing. Soon enough, I found a small back exit that consisted of only one turnstile and nearly no tourists, and for some reason I thought that was the perfect place to go instead of somewhere where I would be protected by tons of people. As I was starting to walk up the stairs, I laughed at myself for overreacting at the man just looking at me on a packed subway, and someone grabbed my arm very tightly. I froze halfway up the stairs and whipped around. It was the man, panting, squeezing my bicep like his life was depending on it. I was too shocked to say anything, and just stared him down. "Hey," he said eventually, not taking my obvious fears into consideration. "You're very beautiful." "Thanks," I managed to say eventually, and tried to rip my arm from his grip, but he held on tighter. At this point I was starting to panic. I looked around and found that because I'd chosen the quieter exit, it led to a pretty empty side street, and there were only a few people walking around. "Can I have your number?" Keep in mind that this man looks around 35 with a greying beard and nice business clothes on, while I wasn't short or young looking. I was very obviously a teenage girl. I stared at him. "No!" I wrenched my arm from his grip and started to walk up the stairs again, trying to stay calm. The man kept following me, and when I made it to the top step, he grabbed me again. "Come on, sweetie, why not? You're so pretty." I said thanks again, because I guess I was just too polite not to, but firmly shook my head and told him, "No, you can't." "Why not?" he asked. "Because I'm 15. This was my attempt to give the man the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he thought I was 20-something and genuinely just wanted to give me his number, right? Instead, the man smiled a wider smile. his grip tightening. So? That's illegal. So? So no. I was thoroughly terrified at this point, and I pushed him off me and bolted out of there down towards the more populated area. Behind me, this man was shouting at me to come back, and that we could have a good time. But I just kept on running, and eventually lost him in the thick crowds of Times Square. Once or twice I looked back, and the first few times I noticed his head popping up and down as he tried to shove past tourists. But I eventually lost him in the crowd. I made it safely to the movie, but took a huge detour to get there, so that I could stay in the streets crowded with people. Once there, I took the time to roll my sleeves up, and noticed the man had squeezed my arm so hard he had left light bruises on my bicep. I don't think that man's intentions were innocent, or what he was thinking chasing a clearly terrified young girl out of a subway. But I hope to never meet him or anyone like him again. When my son was about 6 months old, I had a dream that I was at my grandparent's house with him. My grandfather was holding my son and crying while I spoke with my grandmother. I told her that I wished her and my grandfather were still alive to see my son, and she said, "Don't worry, we see him." I didn't think anything else until 5 years later, I was talking to my sister, and I mentioned that I'd had a dream about my grandparents. She said, "Was Papa Joe," that's what we called our grandfather, "holding your son while he rocked in his chair? And did Grandma tell you they were watching you?" "Yes," I said. "How did you know that?" I had the same dream when my son was 6 months old. And more recently, my son, he was 20 at the time, was driving home from work late one night. As he drove, he said he very clearly heard my mother, who had been dead for 2 years, say, "Jonathan, stop the car." Out of reflex he did, and as soon as he stopped, 3 deer ran out in front of him. Had he not stopped the car, he'd have hit them. This happened several years back, but it still gets to me. I'm an American living in France. At the time of this incident, I was working in a hotel kitchen for a 5-star hotel. I had to drive 30 minutes, catch a 30-minute metro, and then walk another 10 to get to and from this hotel. I'd work from 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. every day, and the boss was horrible. The customers were uppity people who thought 5-star meant that the staff are not human. Basically, it was the worst. One day I was having a particularly bad shift. My hair was gross, my face was numb from smiling at rude customers, and all I wanted was to go home, take a shower, and sleep. So I put my earphones in and waited for the metro. At this stop, it was super busy, so the metro opened from both doors, letting people get on one side and off the other. The rest of the stops weren't as busy, so they only opened in the opposite side so people could get out. When the metro arrived, I stepped on and stood next to the door that wouldn't open again, knowing I could lean back for the rest of the trip. Then a man in an electric wheelchair rolled on, and he just stopped in front of the same doors as I was planning to lean against. He had a few bags hanging from the back of his chair, and they weren't pulled up enough so the door would shut on his bags. I knew the doors would close and remain closed, so instead of just telling him to pull them up a bit, I held the bags forward so that they wouldn't get caught in the door. The door closed, I let go, and the guy smiled at me. Then he started speaking to me. I had my earphones in, so I couldn't hear what he said. I was exhausted, but I'm a nice person, so I took them out and started talking to him. He clearly had a disability, as his speech was pretty hard to understand. My French isn't bad, but it wasn't good enough to understand him. "Sorry," I told him, "I don't speak French." And he immediately switched to English. It was a normal conversation. Where are you from? What are you doing? How long have you been here? "You're beautiful. Are you getting off at this place?" I was getting a little weirded out, but I said, "No, I'm getting off elsewhere," which is one stop before where he said. He said, "Get off at this place with me. You can come over and we can hang out." I politely declined and he said, "Kiss me." Screw it, I thought. I said no and put my earphones back in, ignoring him. He kept talking, but I couldn't hear him, and I was blatantly ignoring him. Then he pushed a loud buzzer on his chair to get my attention. Everyone was looking at us now, and I would have looked terrible if I'd have kept ignoring him. So I pulled my earphone out and he kept trying to talk to me, asking if I had a boyfriend, if I wanted to be his girlfriend, if I would kiss him. Keep in mind, I'm like 20 at this point, and he's a solid 50. Finally, my stop arrives, I say goodbye and he rolls out the metro with me. I told him that this isn't his stop, and he said that he was coming home with me. I was thoroughly creeped out, but I figured I could ditch him easily at this point. We were 2 floors underground and I could easily run up those stairs before he could get the elevator. Feeling like a complete douche for trying to ditch a disabled guy, I stick to my plan, sprinting up the stairs, tripping a few times as I did so, mind you, and get to the ground floor and walk outside, satisfied that he is gone. As I'm walking to my car, I hear that buzz. He's behind me, zooming pretty fast after me, and I start running, terrified of this dude who won't leave me alone. I get to my car, and I'm so freaked out that my hands are shaking, and I'm having trouble getting the keys into the car. Finally, I do. I hop in, put it in reverse, and when I check the mirrors, there he is, parked behind my car and buzzing at me. I don't know what to do at this point. I can't reverse and run him over. I'm certainly not going to get out and talk to him, but I have to get home, so I can't just sit there all day. This standoff lasts for about 10 minutes, before he finally just rolls away, glaring at me as he does so. I peel out there and drive home, shaken but satisfied that I'd seen the last of that guy. The next morning, as I pull into the parking lot, still sleepy but ready for work, I get out of the car, get down to the metro, and there he is, waiting on the platform. I'd forgotten that the day before, I told him I worked every day from 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. He knew I'd be there, and he knew when. He smiled when he saw me and began rolling over. I book it back up the stairs, calling my boss on the way, telling him I'm going to be late to work, and ended up just driving into the city, wasting gas and spending a ton of money on parking. I haven't seen him since, and I've since started going to a different metro station. There are few other stations I can park at, and they're sketchy as hell. But this guy has very limited movement, so I know there's probably nothing he could have done to hurt me. And he was probably just a lonely guy who wanted someone to talk to, but still. Now I panic every time I see a wheelchair. I've only had sleep paralysis once in my life, and it was terrifying. I had woken from a deep sleep and was completely aware of everything. I could feel the blanket laying on me and the exact position I was laying in. What scared me was the presence I felt hanging over me at the foot of my bed. It was heavy and dark. I was panicking and trying my hardest to move. I kept thinking, I need to move, over and over, and I passed out. I didn't immediately remember what happened in the morning. The memory came back later that day, and I discussed it with some of my work friends, and their opinions ranged from normal to paranormal. I was little on the fence to which it was, but I was scared to sleep for a while. A few weeks later, I was drifting off to sleep when I felt the presence again. This time it was beside my bed. I was facing away from it and went stiff, hoping it would go away. It took me a few minutes to get the courage to flip around. When I did, I caught a very clear view of it before it vanished. It was a dark shape that almost resembled a human, but wasn't solid enough in shape. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. I told my best friend about it. That's when I learnt what it was. Shades feed off your energy. They're drawn to negative emotions like stress and anxiety, which mine were very high at the time. She's a witch and brought me a bottle that contained Himalayan sea salt, rose petal, and a few other things. I only saw it once after that. I was trying to sleep but still very awake. I opened my eyes and saw it, as clear as the other time before it vanished again. I hadn't felt its presence, and I believe it was my friend's concoction that kept it away. It's been about a year since that happened, and I think it actually got rid of it. I've never really believed in the paranormal, but haven't denied it either. But after tonight, I'm 110% sure that it exists. I work in a care home for the mentally challenged / severely handicapped. We have 2 people working night shift, one awake and one sleeping in case something happens that needs 2 people. Yesterday was my first awake night shift. Nothing spectacular happened, just sounds I've never heard while working day, and didn't really pay any mind to it. I just thought it was weird. The sound I noticed most sounded like someone using a belt and slapping it against something with a little bit of force, but not a lot, and the timing between is erratic, but not longer than 3 seconds between each, not shorter than 1 second. My shift starts at 9. Nothing really weird happened, just the sounds that I heard the day before started to begin around 10. My colleague that has worked there for several years commented on the belt sound and said that he had never heard it before. Now, I begin to feel uneasiness in my body. You know, just me expecting the worst. The belt sound stopped after 4 to 5 whips. Everything is quiet and sound until 2. That's when I have to give someone their medicine. Just outside the person's apartment, there is an entrance, 10 meters in front of the door to the apartment. The entrance door is made of thick and sturdy glass and metal. Just when I'm going to try and give the person their medicine, I hear a really loud sound from the entrance. It literally sounded like someone ran right into the door. I know how it sounds because every apartment building in the neighborhood has that kind of door as an entrance, and in my drunken adventures I've run into one of them and know exactly what it sounds like. Really didn't pay that much attention to it, started wrapping up and heading out of the apartment and went into the next one to take the trash out. Just as I exit, I hear someone tugging at the door handle with all the might of an angry teenager at the staff toilet door that's right around the corner. I stop dead in my track, and my heart skips a beat. I hastily check the door, and it's open. The goddamn door is open, and I can guarantee on my mother's grave that I closed it 10 minutes earlier. Now I'm scared. I check every door in the whole building, and every door that is supposed to be closed and locked is locked and closed. It's impossible that it was my colleague, since I would have heard the staff sleeping room door open and close since it's right next to the staff toilet. After that, I walked into the staff room and have been sitting here for 2 hours since I'm too scared to move, and I don't want to step 1 foot outside until 5 a.m. Everything that's supposed to be done is done too. Just 3 hours left of this shift. I'm sure I'm gonna have bad nightmares. I've always had vivid dreams, but these few I remember when I was a kid are more weird. I was 6 to 8 when these started. I do have very vivid dreams, but none of these have ever felt the same. As I was young, I don't remember all the details, but the gist is that I would dream about a woman in a white dress, in her mid-20s I'd say. She was younger and had smooth arms. I could never see her face, but there was a man with her every time. He had blonde brown hair, a full beard, and I could see his face. He was dressed in white too. Pretty much normal humans, and we would be in the woods sometimes behind my house. After the first dream, I started having weird things happen in my sleep. Like one time I woke up, well, I thought I was, but I couldn't move. But I knew I was being moved, and somehow I was under my bed, which wasn't that high off the ground, and had containers in front of me that had to move in order to get under my bed. Something was moving me, and I had no control. The dreams would continue for a year or more. I was still very young, but the last one happened. I remember being in the woods, and the woman and the man were there, and they were standing on the deck of a ship about to walk aboard, and there were lights, very bright. I think other people were on that ship, and I felt a presence, but don't remember seeing anything this time. My whole family was there, and the neighbors, which we were related to, meeting, and they were telling us thanks and goodbye. I have no idea why they seemed very grateful, and never dreamed of them again. I'm just really curious if anyone has had these types of dreams, or even seen these two in their sleep. I've always been curious, but never found an answer. This happened to me in 2004, but I still get chills thinking about it as I write it. My parents raised me to always pay close attention to my surroundings, and at least on this occasion, I'm pretty sure it saved my life. It was early to mid-February, and I was visiting Boston, Massachusetts, to compete in an annual high school debate tournament. My team was staying at a hotel in Kendall Square near the Charles River. This particular area of Boston, where the hotel was located, wasn't very busy at night, mainly because the hotel was smack in the middle of an area dominated by offices. In fact, aside from the hotel itself, I remember there being nothing else to speak of on the street where this all happened. The tournament was held across the river, a very short subway ride away. Because of the way my day was scheduled, all of my debate rounds were held in different buildings than the rest of my team, and I finished my day later than everyone else. By the time I was finished, the rest of my team was back at the hotel. Having grown up in a big city, I had no problem taking the train by myself, so I caught the subway back to the hotel. I didn't really have any choice in the matter anyway. Now the exit of the subway station was across the street and around half a block down from the hotel entrance, which was set back from the sidewalk by a huge courtyard. It wasn't a very long walk, but in the bitter cold darkness of a winter night, it certainly felt like it was. The sun had already set by the time I got to my stop. I remember noticing how empty the train was, how dark it seemed when I reached the top of the escalator stairs and stepped outside. I always find myself slightly disoriented when I get out of the subway, so I stopped and looked around for the hotel entrance. And that's when I saw him. Almost as soon as I stepped outside, a lone jogger ran past the subway entrance. He was dressed from head to toe in black, including gloves and a ski mask, wearing a black baseball cap on top of the ski mask, which I remember thinking was strange. Aside from the two of us, there was no one else on the street. He passed by me quickly, and being the cautious city boy that I was, I watched him for a moment as he continued down the street. Realizing that the hotel was in the opposite direction, I turned away after a few seconds and crossed the street. I just made it across to the other side of the street when I heard them, coming from behind me, moving incredibly fast. Footsteps. I turned to quickly look over my shoulder. At some point the jogger had turned around, and he was sprinting diagonally towards me from across the street. By the time I saw him, he had crossed most of the street and was maybe 10 feet away. I'm not ashamed to admit that the fight or flight response took over, and I immediately noped out of there, taking off running for the hotel as fast as I could. A while back, I read that looking over your shoulder as you run slows you down. Even though I could still hear his footsteps behind me, I didn't dare to see where he was. I just ran as fast and as hard as I could, down the street and through the hotel courtyard. I was still sprinting when I hit the revolving doors, and it was only when the door swung into the lobby that I looked behind me again. The courtyard was empty. I don't know at that point if he stopped chasing me, but I do know that no one takes a diagonal beeline sprint towards a young stranger across an empty street at night unless they mean to do you some kind of harm. Thankfully, I never found out what his intentions were. For all I know, it could have just been a straightforward mugging. But since 2004, over 20 young men have been found drowned in Boston's underways under bizarre circumstances. Sometimes, when I think back on the jogger ski mask and baseball cap obscuring his face, his arms pumping as he ran at me, I wonder if I almost became one of them. Several months ago, my wife and I went to bed as we normally do. I have untreated sleep apnea, which means that I never really get a good night's sleep and I'm always tired. I can lie down and be asleep in the middle of a sentence. As I was in that extremely short period of not awake but not really asleep, I could feel myself sinking deeper into sleep. As I approached true sleep, I had a brief impression of being in another location, with a nurse nearby saying, "Doctor, he's starting to wake up." I knew somehow that I had been in a coma and that I was starting to get out of it. Then I started flipping back into the coma there while waking up here and hearing the nurse say, "Never mind, false alarm, he's still in a coma." It was just like an old-fashioned balance scale, as on one side it rose and the other fell. It happened again a second time, but I'm not sure if it was that night or the next. I had a bad dissociative episode recently and the memory of this fed into it. After all, if everything here is a coma dream, I may have loved ones there waiting for me to wake up. My grandmother had passed away about a week prior, and I was sleeping in bed when I suddenly woke up. My grandma was standing at the door. I knew it couldn't be because she was obviously deceased. I didn't move, and she slowly began to glide towards me. She reached down, touched my feet, and said, "Everything's gonna be okay, mijo." It was strangely calm, and she just glided back. Knowing this was impossible, I assumed that it was a dream, so in an attempt to check reality, I reached over and unplugged my alarm clock, plugged it back in, and went back to sleep. The next morning, my mum woke me up, and when I checked the time, it was flashing 3:17. It was actually 7:30. I was strangely okay with the anomaly, and accepted the fact that my dead grandma stopped in to say, "What's up?" "Get off me." I woke up saying those exact words after a few seconds, and I instantly remembered why I'd said that. I was having sleep paralysis. There was a woman in the corner of my room and she was simply standing there. I tried to move, to turn on my light, but she was weighing me down. I struggled until I finally saw her move. She started walking towards me and I tried calling out my sister's name. I felt like I was suffocating and just wanted it all to stop. The woman was one step away and I could finally see her. Her face, or lack of. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just long hair and sharp nails. She's climbing on top of me and began tearing away my skin. I tried screaming for help. I tried moving to push her off me, but nothing worked. But the weird thing is she started molesting me. She put her hands inside me and I couldn't take it anymore and I wanted it all to stop. I slowly started regaining a little bit of movement, as well as my ability to speak. Although I'm sure it didn't take me too long to wake up. It felt like centuries. As soon as I woke up, I looked to my right, which was where my window was, and there she was. She stood outside of my window until she suddenly vanished. This happened in 2017, and the next time I saw her was in 2018. Except, I moved to a different house. I once woke up at night and there was this figure standing next to my bed. It looked like a small boy, maybe 5 years old, wearing one of those old-timey sailor suits that children used to get dressed up in the late 19th to early 20th century. The boy was semi-transparent and asked for help. If you think it sounded creepy so far, it got worse. I suddenly saw myself from another angle, with my eyes open, staring at the boy ghost. And my body rose up, and I said in a deep, unnatural voice, "Your soul is mine." And my mouth opened, wider than a human mouth should, more like a snake's mouth, and I swallowed the ghost. Then I woke up, thinking, wow, that was a rather creepy dream. Strangely enough, my stomach felt full, just as if I had eaten a good meal mere minutes before. It was 5 a.m. though, and I probably hadn't eaten since 1 a.m. like my post-midnight snack. That was a few years ago. Never experienced anything like it again. I do have to say I rarely have traditional nightmares. Was something chasing me? Usually I'm the ones chasing something.